Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all back. I know many of you that were at the Energy Conference have had a full day, we're in for a real treat. We're honored today to have Senator Dodd, the Special Presidential Advisor for the Americas, who will be speaking to us about U.S. foreign policy amidst changing geopolitics. It promises to be, I think, an interesting discussion. We also have Rolando Gonzalez-Boonster, Chairman of InterEnergy, who's a board member of the Institute of the Americas, and a longtime friend of Senator Dodd, and Rolando will introduce Senator Dodd. Rolando?
Be kind.
It's very hard to introduce somebody like Chris Dodd. It would take a long time to read all his accolades and all his accomplishments. Suffice it to say that he was the longest serving U.S. Senator from Connecticut, 30 years in the Senate, sitting next to Jim Biden a great deal of the time. He was also, previous to that, he had been a member of Congress for 6 years from Connecticut. He fathered and co-authored lots of legislation that changed a lot of the way we deal with our lives today. He was involved in many committees, including banking and energy and foreign relations. He co-authored the Dodd-Frank bill that today regulates the way banks do business, and which came about after the banking system almost collapsed the economy of the United States and the world. Chris Dodd does not need me to tell you about who he is, because all you have to do is Google him and spend a couple of hours reading about it. I will deal a little bit with a different aspect of Chris Dodd. I met Chris Dodd over 56 years ago in a little road in the Dominican Republic. He was at that time serving in the Peace Corps, doing the type of work that has brought him close to all the Latin Americans. He was hitchhiking, and I was in the car with my father-in-law, who was the Uruguayan ambassador, my future father-in-law. At the time I was single. The future, my father-in-law was the Uruguayan ambassador to the Dominican Republic. So we picked up Chris, who was trying to get to Santiago from the little town of Monción, where he was working as a Peace Corps volunteer. And he used to make $20 a month and lived like a king. And in those days, money got you a long way. But from that day on, this was 1967 or 68, we became great friends. In talking to Chris, as I first met him, I already knew about him because his brother had been my professor of Latin American history at Georgetown, and who later became Bill Clinton's ambassador to Uruguay. So I met Chris then, and I realized the type of guy he was. And over the years, we always kept in touch, and he visited me many times in the Dominican Republic, and we saw each other also in the United States. And I always, Chris is such a special human being because he has what Rudyard Kipling called, he could walk with kings and still maintain the common touch in the poem If. And I always found that Chris Dodd had a way with people. A few months ago, I had the privilege of flying with Chris in the Dominican Republic to the Haitian border. We went to see the operations of a free zone that hires and gives work to 20,000 Haitians. But before going there, Chris said, let's go to Monción. We get to Monción, and in this little town, maybe 3,000, 4,000 people, clean as a whistle, beautiful little town. The whole community comes out to see him. And they take us to this house where all of his former friends and people he dealt with and lived with gave him a huge breakfast. And we had one of the best breakfasts that I've ever had, the greatest food you could cook in the countryside of the Dominican Republic. And then they took us down to see the Christopher Dodd street. And the whole thing was so mesmerizing that it really made my trip with Chris. I mean, it's unforgettable. I will never forget that, the way the people that he had lived with and had worked with treated him. And that signifies or gives you an inkling of what kind of guy this guy is. So I can talk and introduce him in other ways, but there's no better way than to relate to that story. We then went to see how the Dominican Republic is dealing with a very delicate issue. And every time that we've needed Chris Dodd's advice, or Chris Dodd's intervention, or Chris Dodd's wisdom, he has always been there. And he is today perhaps the best friend that the U.S. could ever have in Latin America. So it is my enormous pleasure to introduce my friend and one of the smartest men that I have ever had the privilege of being.
We're going to call that an evening right now. Thank you, my friend.
So we got
Thank you, Rolando. Appreciate it. Nice.
Rolando, thanks for that wonderful introduction. Senator, welcome to La Jolla. Welcome to the Institute of the Americas.
Good to be
It's
with
an
you,
honor to
Richard.
have
Thanks
you.
for the invitation.
You're a longtime friend of President Biden, and he asked you to serve as his special advisor to the Americas. Talk to us about that role, and what is your vision for that role, and how are you serving the administration at this time of great change amidst the Americas?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with all of you who are part of this wonderful Institute of the Americas, and so congratulations on many years of building what a wonderful program here. I'm delighted to sit through a couple of the sessions today on energy policy, very worthwhile as well. So I'm deeply grateful to you and the Institute for inviting me to come along. There's as I look around the room, and I know some of the people, Jeff Davidoff, because I've known for over the years, and wonderful ambassador and member of the diplomatic service for many, many years. Tom Shannon is an old friend of mine, and I was going to say, and I can say it about Jeff as well, there hasn't been this much gathered intelligence about Latin America since Tom Shannon or Jeff Davidoff ate alone. That's an old line from Jack Kennedy, going back years. So we thank you for your experience over the years. And I'm delighted again to be here. And so let me try and not filibuster. Having spent 30 years in the United States Senate, you naturally want to filibuster. And so I've got to make sure I don't do that. I'll try and be brief in my answers to all of you. Joe Biden and I served together for 30 years in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, sat next to each other. We're very close friends. I'm very fond of him. I like him a great deal. I know him very, very well. But today he's no longer just my friend and a Senate colleague as President of the United States, and that's different. So I don't talk to him every day. I don't visit him all the time, contrary to what people think. But he asked me back in December of 2021, when they were beginning to organize for the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, if I'd be involved and help. And I was delighted to do so. And so we started the journey on that process. And the summit turned out to be successful, in my view. It started out a little shaky, but obviously he was following an administration that hadn't paid much attention to the region at all. And to the extent there was contact, it was more of a hostile relationship, generally speaking. So there was a lot of work to be done, not just in terms of what he wanted to do, but also trying to reassure allies and friends over the years that this was a new day under a new administration with a much more positive attitude about the region. We can get to that in a little bit, Richard, but I think it was important. I wouldn't have done this had it not been a sense about him. We served together. Joe Biden, as a senator, didn't spend a lot of time on Latin American issues. Very few people did, regrettably. When I went to the Foreign Relations Committee, was most junior member of the committee in 1981. I was in the minority. Ronald Reagan had just been elected for the first time since the 1950s. Republicans had won control of the Senate. And interestingly, there just wasn't a lot of interest historically. And Jeff can tell you probably more stories about this, but the old story of a former Secretary of State who asked a young diplomat where he wanted to spend his career. And he said Latin America. And the secretary allegedly said, I thought you wanted a career in the diplomatic service. That being involved in the Americas, unfortunately, was not the issue it could have been over the years. There were administrations that were different. Franklin Roosevelt with a good neighbor policy, and Jack Kennedy with the Alianza para Progreso was certainly an effort in a positive direction. But over the years, it was neglect at best and worse in some cases. And so it was an opportunity, I thought, with Joe Biden, who, thanks to President Obama, asked Joe Biden to assume the portfolio of the Americas during his 8 years as vice president. And while not having spent much time at all during his own Senate career, took on the responsibility, in a sense, for the administration of the Americas. And like an awful lot of people who didn't have much experience, he became very excited about Latin America during the 20 or so trips he made as vice president of the United States. So it was a different Joe Biden coming into the presidency regarding how he saw our hemisphere than certainly had been the case before. And so when he asked me to get involved with him, I had a good feeling about his willingness to make a difference, or to try and make a difference if we could. And so that's how this began. And I believe that's been the case. Now, obviously, events even in the last few days, there's always a danger that something else explodes someplace on the globe and attention gets diverted. I don't know of another president in my lifetime who's had as many different issues on his plate than Joe Biden has had thrown at him from day one. Obviously, the economy obviously was huge. The problems obviously that emerged quickly in Russia, in the Ukraine. The problems obviously with the revival of the COVID issue that made it very difficult, go through a difficult time. But literally one issue after another. And the assumption that any president can grapple with all those issues simultaneously, despite having a good team, is really almost impossible to do that. So I'm grateful to him for asking. I'm grateful to him for the kind of emphasis and attention he's paid on this. Maybe we can talk a little bit about it. But he's been really a great asset, and I believe making a difference. Again, I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be working with him. Got a great team. Yesterday, many of you may have been in the room when Brian Nichols, who has spent a career in the diplomatic service, Tony Blinken, I think, is doing a good job, got some good ambassadors. We've got too many cases where we don't have ambassadors, which is a reflection of the polarization politically in Washington. But there are a number of countries in Latin America that have no ambassador, Dominican Republic being one. So that's been a disgraceful performance by the Senate, in my view, of holding up people right and left for really no reason at all, except in some cases ideological reasons, which I think has been a big mistake for our country and for Latin America. But let me stop there and thank again. And Rolando, thank you for that. I'm going to get a tape recording of that introduction you gave me and bring it to my family. And
bring it to your wife.
I get picked up, and I come from a big family of 5 siblings, and so they ought to hear those remarks.
Let's talk about geopolitics. There's a lot going on in the world today. As you mentioned, COVID. We've got growing tensions between the U.S. and China, which has prompted a realignment of our economic system and our trading relationships. A number of U.S. companies are now beginning to look to nearshore or friendshore. Talk to us about what you see as the opportunity in the Americas for nearshoring, and what role do you see the United States playing, both from the government's perspective, but also the role that the private sector can play in seizing this opportunity across the Americas?
Well, it's a great question, and we literally could make the rest of the afternoon just on that one question, in my view. I think it's, first of all, the timing is essential, in my view, that we begin to move as aggressively as we can to take advantage of the time we're in. I should have probably maybe started my answer to your first question by sharing with you at least some personal views on looking at the hemisphere. I'm a great believer. I think we're undervalued as a hemisphere. I think we have been for years, in my view. I think that's changing for various reasons, but nonetheless, I think there's great opportunities that exist in front of us, not just the United States, but obviously in Europe and the Pacific Rim as well. Again, some of the comments you may have heard yesterday, but I think it's very exciting. I went to Brussels for their meeting they had on Latin America with CELAC, who was there as well. I met with the president of Korea not long ago, who's expressing a significant interest, the 10th largest economy in the world. I was reading this morning about Juntos, a program in Japan that's showing a great interest again in the Americas. We have the APEC meeting coming up. The IDB and the World Bank are showing a tremendous amount of interest. We can talk about that in a minute as well. So I believe we're at a unique moment, but they don't last forever. One of the lessons I've learned in 40 years of elective office in the Congress of the United States is windows open, windows close, and they close a lot faster than they open. And when they do close, you can wait forever for them to open up again when opportunities present themselves. I think we're in a unique moment to take advantage of the time we're in, the opportunities that exist. There are a few of us here with gray hair that may recall not long ago in Latin America when it was a very different picture in many, many ways. When certainly you can go back down and go from whether you want to start in Chile or in Brazil or Argentina and so forth, where you had military juntas, tremendous strife and so forth existing in one country after another. Today, most of the countries we're talking about are democracies. Now, and some of your minds may not be perfect democracies, but certainly a vastly different picture politically than was the case not long ago. And obviously, we're seeing the values in the region. 50% of all the forests in the world reside in our hemisphere. Rare minerals and so forth we know about throughout the region are in our hemisphere. Fresh water supplies are in our hemisphere compared to what exists in the rest of the planet. You go down that long list of assets that we have, both natural resources and human resources. This hemisphere is rich with them. We represent about 12 or 15% of the population of the globe, and yet we represent about 30% of the landmass of the globe. Highly urbanized, far too much in my view. About 85% of the population are located in large urban settings for a lot of obvious reasons, people seeking economic opportunity. I'm a great believer that if you can deal with economic reasons and fear, then people don't emigrate. My family left Ireland in the 19th century because of fear, lack of opportunities. And that story can get repeated over and over and over and over again about the growth of the United States in immigration. And so today what we're looking at, if we can improve the economic conditions, if you can reduce the sense of fear that people have in certain places, then I think we still have immigration, but we don't have the massive problems we had. People need to understand that immigration problems, which I'm sure we may talk about, you've got 120 million people that are literally on the move around the planet, about 20 million in our hemisphere along the way. And so if we can begin to do some things that deal with the underlying causes of this, people will do what they've done. They prefer to stay where they're familiar, linguistically, culturally, and so forth. They only leave because they feel they have no other recourse but to do that, in the majority of cases, in my view. So we have an obligation, it seems to me, to start to think not only about how you deal with the current situation globally, not just locally, but also how we can underpin the reasons that people are inclined to make those moves. So I'll spend a little bit of time. There are a lot of things going on, as some of you heard from Brian yesterday. But on November 3rd, we have a very important meeting coming up in Washington, D.C., at the White House, in the East Room of the White House, which in my view has never been used for the kind of meeting that will be hosted. The President of the United States has invited 11 other heads of state from Central America, the Caribbean, as well as in South America, to participate in the idea that he offered in Los Angeles back a year and a half ago, and that is for America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. A big title, but nonetheless, the idea is basically to really to introduce or bring for the first time, maybe ever, real partnerships. The page is blank. The idea is to come together and talk about what we can do together in order to make this hemisphere more attractive to not just U.S. interests, but also interests from Europe, from Asia, from other places, that will understand and see the opportunities that they present, not only for themselves, but obviously for the people who live in our hemisphere. And so it's a very important meeting. Part of what we're going to have on the day before November 3rd is the IDB is hosting a forum with the private sector. The IDB has now put a lot of money into the IDB Invest Fund, which is the private sector fund at the IDB. which is going to be terribly important, as well as the lab programs, are not as expensive. The World Bank, under its new leadership of Mr. Bang, is showing a real interest as well in the Americas, and will participate as well. Not to the extent the IDB will, but nonetheless, having this gathering of heads of state, and a lot of work is going on, and has been now for the last number of weeks, in preparation of that meeting, because if I don't want to turn it just a photo op, where we get a lot of people together in the East Room of the Capitol, take a picture, and that's the end of it. So it's a new opportunity, in a sense. And maybe the best deliverable I have is the President of the United States, who cares about this. We got a big election coming up in a year. We realize what can happen if we end up with the wrong results. But you got to start. If you just wait around when you think you've got the perfect opportunity, you can miss the opportunity. And I believe we have a rich opportunity right now to make a difference. And so I get excited about it, but I believe we have that moment. Secondly, and lastly, I'll mention this point before going on to more questions you may have, Richard, is for the first time I've got bipartisan interest in this subject matter alone. Michael Bennet of Colorado and Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Republican, have now written a bill. It's about the size of a New York telephone book, but nonetheless, the center of it is economic investment, is growth, job creation, and so forth, to get these countries again moving again by encouraging the kind of things, well, you've been talking about here, energy policy, obviously, democracy, healthcare issues, and the like. So between having bipartisanship beginning in the Congress, as well as what we're trying to do, you begin to marry the financial interest as well as the political interest to begin to work at this. Now, people accuse me of being not being realistic enough, given the history. And I'll admit to being guilty of that. But I also believe we each get an opportunity to make a difference in our lifetime on something we believe is worthwhile. I believe it's worth our interest to try and improve the life of people in our hemisphere, to give them a sense of hope and opportunity. And I believe what President Biden is trying to do, and this is not a political statement, obviously I'm close to him politically, but I see with President Biden, the team he's put together on the subject matter of our Americas creates opportunities for us that haven't existed for a long time. Will it work? I don't know. Is it worth trying? You bet it is. If we don't try and bring these pieces together, we could be gathering here for the years to come, and we'd be looking back, in my view, and saying we missed that window. The window closed before we realized the opportunity in front of us. So gatherings like this make a difference. And I'm again grateful for the invitation to be with you. But I'm an optimist about this. I believe if we begin to use our intelligence together cooperatively, I was very impressed with the conversations I heard in some of the alternative energy. This guy here has forgotten more about alternative energies than anyone I know in terms of what he's been able to do already, just as one entrepreneur in the region. So I'm excited about the opportunity, Richard. I believe what you're doing here at the Institute as well as elsewhere can make a huge difference for us. And if I get a little excited about this, I apologize, but I believe it's worth a try.
No, I appreciate it. Senator Dodd, you alluded to LA. President Biden hosted the Summit of the Americas last June. He brought together leaders from throughout the Americas. You played a key role in that summit. This past April, Anthony Blinken and you were instrumental in the City Summit. Talk to us about those two summits, how you see the role of those summits in helping to build a stronger levels of collaboration across the Americas. And what do you see as some of the outcomes of that from the administration standpoint?
Well, you know, and again, I think that Brian mentioned this yesterday briefly, but it deserves being repeated for those of you who weren't here. I don't know why we haven't done the city summit every few years for the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. Again, it's hard to briefly describe this to you, but meeting in Denver, there were 3,000 people that showed up in the Civic Center to support this city's summit from the Americas. About 400 mayors from across the region came to that summit for 2 or 3 days. And if you could just get a notion, when heads of state come, as they did in Los Angeles, there's a lot of security. Everyone sort of prepared documents ahead of time, what you're going to sign, what you're not going to sign, and so forth. It gets orchestrated so tightly in many ways, there doesn't seem to be much opportunity for innovation or creativity when they gather. Important. I don't minimize the importance of having, because spontaneous things can occur. But I got to tell you, if you walked into that large room in Denver, Colorado, and to see 3,000 people in that room, 400 mayors, without the kind of security heads of state get. And they were starting to talk to each other. How do you fix your sewers in Cleveland if I'm coming from Barranquillo someplace? And so they began that communication on a very granular level. And so we ought to be doing a lot more of that. And I think, as someone has pointed out, democracy at that point, really, you don't have the choice of going off to Bogota, to the capital city, or to go to other places. If you're the mayor of Denver, Colorado, or Cleveland, Ohio, or Barranquillo, you don't get to leave to go to the capital city to be in the national legislature. And so people every day will question you whether or not you're getting the job done. So I think we need to revive this idea. I hope we will more frequently, because I think it's a great place to begin the process, and not just at the national level, but at that level, at the community level, or the governorship or state level as well. So that to me is exciting to keep that going. And I think we will. I think there was such a good feeling about it that we ought to maintain that going forward. I think obviously what you're doing here at the Institute is critically important as well, to bring people together on subject matter, particularly on energy, which is critical for us, obviously, as we look down the road. So again, I think, again, the team has made a difference. I think it's worthwhile. I emphasize again for you, though, Richard, we've got to get involved the rest of Western Europe, the European Union. I'm very impressed that President Sanchez in Spain has taken over the European Council or Union, forget which now, unfortunately, just for 6 months. I don't know where they came up with that idea. You can hardly discover where the men's rooms are at 6 months in these places here. But for 6 months, at least we've got an opportunity, and hopefully we'll set enough of a strong agenda within the European Union. I just came back a week ago and participated in a forum in La Toja in the west of Spain, where primarily a private sector group was meeting to talk about the future, and we concentrated on the Americas and what people were doing or thinking of doing. Spain will be our leader in some ways. Maybe a little harder to get some of the other members of the European Union to pay attention. But I think Spain would like to pay a greater interest in the region, and that's to our benefit, in my view. And as I've mentioned, places like Korea, Japan, the APEC meeting coming up. We've got 5 countries in the Americas, in our hemisphere, that'll be at that meeting in San Francisco in a couple of weeks. That's all an indication here that we ought to be attracting people from across the globe who will see the value of investing in the Americas, and talking about how we can encourage more of that and help promote it as well.
On a related note, we're seeing with the war in Ukraine, the need for greater collaboration among allies based on values.
Right.
How do you see the opportunity in the Americas in the U.S. collaborating with Europe, Canada, Japan, Korea, as you just mentioned, in terms of building momentum and helping to create greater hope and more economic opportunity and potentially more investment?
Well, part of it is that I was fascinated in one of the last meetings I attended here in talking about alternative energy ideas. And I forget who it was. I think it was the gentleman from Volaris, the airplane company. And he said something which I agree with. There are 20 free trade agreements all over the globe. 12 of them are in our hemisphere, in the Americas, 12 out of the 20. And they've worked well in many cases, but they've done far less than I think the original hopes were. The hopes were you'd begin with a free trade agreement, and there would be a growth and a maturation, if you will, so you'd end up with more regional economic integration. That, I think, was the idea, and Jeff, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was certainly part of the idea. So there have been success stories, but less than what I think originally was planned for. How can we grow this? And I think that's an extremely important point. And again, the gentleman from Volaris was making this point. When you start talking about airline fuels and the like, one country does something, someone else does something else, and it gets awfully difficult to create harmonization with all of that. And that's one of the problems we face, I think, in our hemisphere. And that is, again, individual countries will take on responsibilities. But unless we realize that without regional integration, at the very least, most of these issues are going to be too costly to do, too difficult to do, politically impossible in many cases. So we need to start working with each other to the extent on energy policy, on growth issues, on job creation. You go down the list, and if we depend upon each country doing something in a positive and creative way, that's great news. But if Colombia, under President Petro, who lists the environmental climate change as his number one issue, the number one issue. I've heard him say it 5,000 times since he's been in office, and that's great news. But if he's the only one that really has that at the top part of his list, it's an important country, obviously exposure in the Amazon and so forth. But unless there's cooperation with other countries on the same theme somehow, energy costs, we start talking about grids here. Again, having wonderful energy policies in one country without developing that policy that it can embrace other countries as well is going to be a problem for us. So we really need to have that level of cooperation regionally that I think is missing. And there's a lot of reasons historically for it, in my view. I've often think of this as probably the wrong case to bring up. But I don't think we would have ever adopted a constitution in the United States in 1789 had it not been for a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, about 10 years before, where they're only called the Articles of Confederation were agreed to by the 13 colonies in the United States. They had no intention of becoming a country, but they were beating the hell out of each other with tariffs and taxes between those 13 colonies. They finally said to each other, what the hell are we fighting with each other for? The real opponent we've got is the United Kingdom. So why don't we work out our economic difficulties here? And then, of course, 10 years later, someone said, well, how about it becoming a country? Well, that was a hard sell. But had we not done the first thing with the economic issues 10 years earlier, I don't think you ever would have had a constitution, at least not initially, in my view. In a sense, that model is what we need to be thinking about in part as well in the Americas, particularly in Central and South America and the Caribbean, is how can we be working together so we can regionalize a lot of these issues here, which insist upon it. Otherwise, it'll be nothing more than chatter and talk. So we need to convince those coming from Europe and from Asia and the United States, the private sector investment, that look at these issues a lot of times figure, I don't see how I can navigate all of this. So if we do anything else, I hope in the coming years, it'll try to encourage more of regionalization on some of the critical issues that we've been talking about. So that to me is one of the major hurdles we face.
So on this topic of cooperation, what role do you see the private sector playing, civil society, in helping to bring about this change? Many times they work in silos.
Yeah.
Government sometimes works in silos.
Absolutely.
How can we break some of those barriers?
Well, the
and
private
affect some
sector
change?
could do it. You're doing it already. You know, first of all, the United States is the largest trading partner in the Americas. We're now the largest trading partner we have in the world is with Mexico, not with China any longer. Our trading, our trading issue, I think last year we're close to $2 trillion, 1.9, I think it was. Already in 2023, it's about 570 billion or more and growing. So trade is really, again, if anyone questions whether or not there's any wisdom in doing this, clearly the evidence today shows it can bring tremendous rewards, not just for businesses that do business in the Americas, but also for the countries involved. Secondly, you have the foreign direct investment. And again, we represent about 38% of that in the hemisphere, leading it in many ways. We don't do as much of this. We still do the old idea of lending, in a sense. But I think we're far wiser to stick with what we know how to do best. And I think the trade issues are important. I think the foreign direct investment are critically important. And I think we ought to stick with it, and I think people do. And again, the model that was talked about earlier, and that is, and Tom Shannon has talked about this, and some of you who know Tom will say, nothing's perfect. If you're looking for perfection, you're in the wrong business altogether. But we do business all over the world. Some places are easier to do business than others. But you don't not do it because you face some difficulties. If you wait for all the difficulties to disappear, you don't do anything, in my view. So we need to try and also understand the importance of countries themselves and regions to be talking why the environment in that particular country, in that region, what needs to be done to make me more attractive to you. The private sector, not the Peace Corps. I was in the Peace Corps at $20 a month, whatever Robert said I was being paid. But the private sector, I mean, with all due respect, they're wonderful people, but they're making some very cold, hard decisions about where to invest their resources. And they don't do it because they like the people or they think it's a wonderful place to live. They do it because it makes money for them. And if you don't understand that, then we're in the wrong business altogether. So we made to make sure that on things like continuity of policies, transparency and regulations, dealing with supply chains in a way that are reliable. So each of our countries and regions need to understand these businesses can go anywhere, whether they're from Europe or from Asia or from the United States. They can be anywhere they want to be here. We need to make ourselves attractive in the hemisphere so that when people see it, not to become foolish about it, but attractive enough so when we can sell ourselves, in a sense, and say, you ought to come here because of the following reasons, and we can make a difference. So it requires if you will, a partnership, if you will, coming back to that word that is the center of what I believe the President Biden's policies are. How do we make ourselves attractive? What can we else be doing to make sure that we're appealing to that foreign investor, that private sector? The best jobs ever, or the best social program, in my view, ever created in the history of mankind is a decent job. What's the second question you ask someone for what you meet the first time? What's your name and what do you do? And I've never met a human being that didn't like to take pride and they do something worthwhile, no matter how menial it may be. It's a sense of dignity, of self-worth. It holds families together and communities together. It's the best social program ever, in my view. And so by promoting job creation, decent jobs along the way, you begin to find that improvement of a climate of communities and families as well. So to me, it's critical. And you can't talk about job creation and just have governments create them. You have to have a private sector involved or it doesn't happen. So the private sector is not some ideological choice. It has to be a common sense choice that we need to encourage the private sector to make the kind of investments that we think we can offer in our hemisphere. So I think it's a critical component, in the absence of which it gets awfully difficult to imagine the kind of success we'd like to see in our hemisphere.
Thank you, Senator Dodd. We have time for a few more questions.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? We've got a mic. If anybody has a question they would like to ask the Senator.
Get to pick on a former United States Senator. It's a rare opportunity, you know.
Oh. If you can state your name and from.
Hi,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Pablo Barrientos. My question is regarding this opportunity of making the entire region more attractive. What's your view about privatizing a lot of the national-owned companies like Pemex and YPF that's expected to happen in Argentina, so we can, or at least be in a position that can compete with the Middle East and other places that are really exploiting the natural resources?
Yeah. Well, again, you know, these are not ducking the question at all, quite the opposite, but it seems to me this is exactly what people have to make decisions about in their own countries. The politics, trying to shove something down a country's throat doesn't necessarily produce the kind of results you'd like. So I realize they're controversial issues. But I think more and more people begin to realize that the privatization of certain things has great value. But you've got to be able to convince people of the value. It's difficult. If you just try to impose it, I think you can face the kind of opposition which makes it difficult to achieve those results. But again, I believe a good cause can be made for where those happen. Obviously, you hear Rolando knows Argentina better than anyone I know, having come from Argentina originally and follows it closely. And you've got some elections coming up here in Argentina, Mexico, obviously. And a lot of these debates are occurring as to where the future looks like economically. But my own view, I think there's a value in that. But again, I think trying to impose it could pose the kind of political difficulties. Having the debate about it and making a decision, attracting that private investor is critically important, in my view, in the long term. And obviously, privatization can help in that regard. It can attract foreign investment when those opportunities present themselves.
Thank you. Any other questions? We got a question in the back there.
Thank you. Senator, great to hear from you. Duncan Wood from the Wilson Center in Washington. I'd like to ask you about, how you perceive that the region has received overtures from the Biden administration. We've had a whole conversation today about the energy transition and the fact that Latin America can play a central role in the energy transition. It's a priority for the Biden administration. Decoupling from China is a priority for the Biden administration, or de-risking from China, we should say. And also solving the migration crisis is a priority. Those three things come together perfectly in Latin America, I think. And yet, I'm not seeing as much progress on this particular issue in terms of U.S. relations with the region as I'd like to. And I guess I'd just like to ask you, did we miss an opportunity at the Summit of the Americas to talk about critical minerals and energy transition and to bring some of the Latin American producers into the fold? Would it be a good idea for us to invite many of those countries to join the Mineral Security Partnership, for example, which has been such an important diplomatic step forward?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, it's a good question. And look, I was going to mention earlier, but I think I was going on too long at one point. I think we've done a dreadful job of marketing what we're doing. It just stuns me. It used to be a time when maybe we over-marketed in certain ways. But I mentioned to you November 3rd, this meeting coming up. That meeting's been in the planning stages for months. I had hoped it would be in June, frankly, not in November. But always events overtake certain circumstances, make it difficulty. I don't think we talk enough about what we're trying to do. I've even got members of Congress. Tim Kaine's a good friend of mine from Virginia, cares a lot about the hemisphere. And he put out a public statement the other day, sort of not attacking in a hard way, being critical of the Biden administration for not doing enough. And again, we've done an awful lot over the last year or so, rather quickly, in the midst of everything else. But I don't think we've let people know what we're trying to do. I think this APAP meeting could really offer tremendous opportunity. Now, we've got a lot of other things occurring around the world as we sit here tonight that may take away the attention from this subject matter. So we need to do a much better job of telling our friends and allies and others what we're trying to achieve. And I don't think we do that very well. But there are a number of things. I won't go down a shopping list for you, but just in the last year and a half, what we've been able to do coming off the summit. Immigration is going to be a political issue as much, but it's a global issue. Again, you've got 120 million people that are on the move globally here. There was a story not long ago where there were some 5,000 people gathered on the border between Mexico and the United States. In that group of 5,000 people, there were 109 countries represented seeking to come to this country. The idea it's all coming from Guatemala and Honduras and Panama and Colombia. It's a problem, obviously, but it's a global problem. And so suggesting somehow that this is the only issue on the border here, again, I'm a great believer that every country has an obligation to represent its borders and to protect its borders. There's nothing new about that, obviously, and we've benefited tremendously over the years because of immigration. One of the greatest resources of our country has been immigrants in the 250 years. But we need to do a better job of explaining what we're trying to do and how we can help these countries. So I don't disagree with you at all about the marketing of what we've tried to express to people about our really interest in the Biden administration. In their fairness to them, they've had an awful lot of issues on their plate, from pandemics globally to the Ukraine to other matters coming up. I've been able to get bilateral meetings from President Biden, almost every head of state who's asked for them in the region. And they've been very, very good, in a sense. I recently had, in fact, I talked with them today, President Chavez from Costa Rica. And I just want to tell you in this room here, I've known President Biden a long time. And as I said earlier to you, I'm not someone who spends every day with him or talks to him all the time. But in that meeting with President Chavez, Costa Rica's 5 million people, sitting in the Oval Office with President Chavez and President Biden in their respective teams. Within about 10 minutes, President Chavez, and I could see him happen, realized that he was sitting next to a guy who was treating him as a co-equal, was a colleague of his. Two heads of state meeting, talking about common issues. You can't train people to do that necessarily, but he does it really well. He had a lot of meetings with people, these heads of state, private meetings. He's asked each one of them to spend some time alone, chatting with each other. Spent an hour and a half with President Lula of Brazil. Spent about an hour with President Petro of Colombia. At the meetings coming up. And those, I can't begin to tell you the value of that, but establishing those relationships on a human level are critically important when you start having conversations about broader subject matter. I don't know if I'm articulating this well enough for you, but I don't think we've done a good enough job of explaining to people how much time the president and his administration are spending on the Americas. And I can't tell you how pleased I've been personally to watch an administration really kind of weigh in on this with some consistency. So a lot more needs to be done. We're going to end up in a political cycle that started awfully early for me. I'm looking at the institution I spent most of my adult life in going on today, and I've stopped using the word unbelievable because it doesn't even begin to describe how I feel about what's happened in terms of how the Congress is reacting. But we're not alone. You can go and look around the world, and we're not the only country that have demagogues in politics today. So it's a global problem, in my view. And my hope is that we'll somehow grab our insanity before it's all over and realize we need to be on a better path together. And that's not a political statement, that's just a reality. And I'm not alone in those feelings, but we're in desperate need of some maturity, some sensibilities, and my hope that'll come. But in the meantime, I think we can do a better job of describing to people what efforts are being made in these various areas here, from the partnership, the global partnership for integration and investment, for instance. You know, that's we've done $1 billion already on some green energy policies. We've mobilized $30 billion in this area, particularly working with the Caribbean, thanks to people like Rolando and others, to talk about alternative energies, PAC 2030, I guess it is, the PAC, on those issues, and trying to assist, if we can, on those matters. The 4.2 billion we've been able to mobilize in the private sector for the northern tier countries in Central America. I get on a long list of things that actually have stepped up, but I'm 10 people who are aware of the steps that have been made and the contributions we're making, and encouraging the participation of others. I was given an opportunity to talk to the president of Korea. I was given 10 minutes to pick out any subject I wanted to. I did it with Bob Zellick. I did it with Chuck Hagel, Bill Cohen, in a meeting we had with him. And I used my 10 minutes to talk about Latin America and why I thought Korea ought to take a serious look at a place to make investments in this part of the world. And I gather there's been some interest already, not as a result of that conversation, but I think in their own right. So we need to do a better job in an idea of encouraging more of this investment. Obviously, we have a parochial interest in the United States for doing so, but we have a broader interest, in my view, of getting others as well to participate and contribute. In regard to China, we don't tell what countries to have relationships and so forth. I think a lot of people, and again, in my conversations with almost every one of the 34 nations in this hemisphere, they would all prefer to do business with the United States and Europe than they would with China. That's just my opinion. Now, a lot of it may be statements they've made just on their own, but nonetheless, I think given the choice, culturally, linguistically, the United States of America in 4 or 5 years will be the largest Hispanic-speaking country in the world. Right now, we're number 2 to Mexico. It's changing in many ways for the benefit of us, but obviously it's harmful to see the kind of brain drains pouring out of countries that, frankly, are losing a lot of their younger people along the way. In Costa Rica, there are more Americans living in Costa Rica than there are Costa Ricans living in the United States, and there's no reason why that wouldn't be a case in many of these other countries, in my view. If the kind of stability, job creation opportunity, the sense of fear as well is important, stability. So I'm more optimistic about this in a way, and we need to be more optimistic ourselves. Mexico and the United States, we constantly hear stories about what's wrong. It's a remarkable relationship. We've celebrated over 200 years of diplomatic relations this year. A great achievement in many, many ways. And every day, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who move back and forth between our two countries. And there's a lot of good things that happen. We need to be telling that story. I'm not a Pollyanna. I realize there are problems. But if all we ever hear is what's wrong, and the beneficial things that occur, and it's hard to think of other two countries anywhere else on this planet that have the disparities we have in terms of economics and so forth, that we have as good a relationship. In fact, I can recite quickly there are countries that have dreadful relationships that share common borders with each other. And again, I don't want to suggest to you that somehow we ought to gloss over all of this, but we need to remind the American people and others in our own countries, it's a good thing to develop good relationships with each other, and they're beneficial things that accrue to all of us when we have that. So my view is we need to do a better job of promoting these stories. And again, I'm not suggesting everything ought to be a good news story, but we need to remind people there are some wonderful beneficial things that accrue to ourselves in the United States as well as in Mexico because of our relationship. And too often we don't do that, in my view.
Thank you, Senator Dodd.
Yeah.
With that, this concludes our evening. I want to thank you, Senator Dodd, for a wonderful conversation and sharing your perspectives on the American. Rolando, thank you so much for
You didn't
for
have
your
to say a
introduction.
word, for God. You just sat there, for God's sake. Gave this glowing introduction and then didn't say a damn thing while I'm sitting here. He'll tell me over dinner what a fool I made of myself here sitting in this chair.
I want
You were awesome.
to invite you to a reception outside. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to your participation in other Institute events.
And thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me to come by as well. Appreciate it. Thanks, Rolando. Appreciate it. Richard, thank you very much. Yeah. Hope that was okay. I hope I didn't filibuster.
No, you did an amazing job.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's amazing.